Resilience is the ability to persist over time.
In the Manila Bay and other bays that experience red tides, it is the marginalized that is affected in health and in economy.
Engineering is the ability to absorb, thrive, and then recover. The faster you're able to recover, the more resilient.
Sa Pilipino, ito ay katibayan at katatagan sa mahirap na sitwasyon at ang kakayahang bumangon muli.
Yung ecological naman, the ability to adapt. Yung evolutionary resilience, to really innovate and be creative.
Resilience is really being able to spring back from adversity, but it should have learning, and therefore it strengthens you to be more resilient than before the adversity came to you.
Before COVID-19, the Philippines was already on to SMT-based measures to improve its resilience capacity. With COVID, the country was awakened to the need for resilience of our economic, health, and educational status as well.
The country as a whole is, I think, not so resilient because while we have the capabilities, the opportunities, and the resources to cope with COVID-19, the whole body is suffering because the leadership and management is not working so well. When it comes to individual resilience, those who have more resources, capabilities, and opportunities will be more resilient than those who are not.
A lot of the problems really may be interconnected, You have to look at it from a holistic point of view. It encompasses more than natural sciences or physical problem, but also it gets into the ecological, biological, as well as social pa nga.
Among issues and problems we have are poverty, ecosystem destruction, climate change, and variability.
Much of our attention is placed only after the disasters happen. What we should do really is to take early action years before the hazard strikes, and we should put our attention and our resources into that type of planning.
We need SMT-based transdisciplinary and inclusive approach to coping with possible hazards.
The fragmentation of society needs to be resolved for resilience.
Communication is very, very important, and we should communicate to the people using not just scientific communication means, but through arts, music, understand the mindset of the Filipino people so we can communicate better.
Well, the way to move forward is interoperability.
So we have to do a lot of work as a person, as a community, and as an institution to really have resilience as one of the values of the Filipinos. Yung tunay na resilience na towards improvement.
Building resilience requires sustainability science inspired by transdisciplinary approach.
To be sustainable, you have to be resilient. To be resilient, you have to be sustainable.
Go natural, go with nature's flow. Non-structural or natural interventions, as well as good planning, is the most sustainable.
Finally, we need to harness and strengthen the Filipino spirit of bayanihan.
Pero dahil kami ay nasa akademiko,
Kailangan natin
pinag-aaralan namin
matingnan
yung
kung
mga
ano talaga ang kailangan natin not only for ourselves but for a people as a whole.
Resilience ng mga Pilipino towards the collective effort among communities
not to blame anybody.
and the strengthening of
Resilience Live.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the 9th session of the Resilience Live webinar. My name is Rick, and I will be your host for today. The Resilience Live webinar series is brought to you by the UP NOAA Center and the UP Resilience Institute in partnership with UNESCO International Geoscience Program, or IGCP. Together, the UP NOAA Center and IGCP seek to explore geoheritage as a tool for developing resilience to natural hazards. Our partners for this episode include the Lyceum of the Philippines Laguna Biology Society, the UP Los Baños Integrated Natural Resources and Environment Management, the Association of Filipino Forestry Students UPLB, the UP Volcano Tectonics Laboratory, the Mapua Malayan Colleges Laguna, the UP Rockhounds, the Geological Organization of Partido State University, the Association of Geologists and Geological Engineers of Mapua, the Mindoro State University College of Arts and Sciences, Yaman, Philippines, the Center of Neighborhood Studies, and the Philippine Association of Geology Students, Society of Economic Geologists Student Chapter. To our aforementioned partners, we highly encourage you to send us photos of your organization that you are comfortable sharing during our Resilience Live episodes, as these photos will be used to showcase your organization. With that, our speaker for today is a historical geographer who focuses on the way societies interrelate with their environments over time, especially the way people adapt to frequent hazards. For the last 30 years, he has focused his research primarily on Southeast and Central Asia, the Pacific, and North Sea, seeking to understand how societies learn to normalize risk and the way in which communities deal with crises. He is a research fellow at Ateneo de Manila University and professor emeritus at the University of Hull. His most recent publication is a co-edited volume, Why Vulnerability Still Matters, The Politics of Disaster Risk Creation. Here to talk about urban fire as a hazard and urban fire regimes in Manila, I'm handing off the spotlight to Dr. Greg Bankoff for his presentation. Doctor?
Thank you, Rick. Let me share my screen with you. Right. Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about what I think is a very underrated and overlooked hazard, and one that affects millions of people around the world, and that is urban fire. So my talk this afternoon is in two parts. The first part will look at urban fire in general and talk to you a little bit about fire, because I think we have many misconceptions about fire. And then in the second half of my talk, I will turn to talking about urban fire regimes in Manila in particular. Now, before we begin, there are three things basically I'd like you to remember about fire. And the first one is that fire is as much a social as a physical and practical phenomena. It has history, context, and culture. And the second thing I want you to remember is that fire is also a social construction that varies across time, space, and peoples. And the third one, and perhaps most important one, is that fire is still a very real and present danger to many millions of people around the world, especially those living in informal settlements in the large megacities of the global south. So let me briefly start by talking a bit about showing how fires have history. The threat of fire basically largely mirrors the growth of the urban environment, at least until the 19th century. That is, the larger the urban area, there was, the greater was the risk of fire. And the history of fire basically reflects the way in which urban areas were constructed over time. Buildings first being made of wood, then brick, which of course is fired mud, and then concrete. And those stages are commensurate basically with more or less fire. But where wooden structures were common, fire was common. Drying and wetting with the same annual seasonal rhythm, and are basically obeying the same cycles of growth and overgrowth decadence as the woodlands around them. Now, Eric Jones and Lionel Frost talk about the emergence of what they call a fire gap in the 19th century in Western countries, as cities basically adopted more fire-resistant materials, brick in particular. They had gardens too. So fire becomes more of a private loss than a public tragedy. But this fire gap did not uniformly emerge in non-Western cities, which are basically based on a hybrid two-city structure model. Part of the city is what we can call a post-mass conflagration area, the city centers, the commercial and business districts, gated communities. And then there's the other city, which is basically composed of mass flammable areas. And it's much, much larger. Slums, informal structures, and refugee camps, because increasingly around the world, those are becoming a feature of urban life as well. Fires also have culture. People use fire differently. They use it differently in how they cook, in how they heat, in how they light their dwellings. People light fires differently. They use different fuels. They have different kinds of hearths. They light fires for different purposes. People think about fire differently. In a utilitarian approach, fire can be sacred, fire can be cleansing or medicinal, and of course, fire can be criminal, as in the case of arson. People fight fires differently. The modern cities, cores of those modern cities, have a more preventative technology. They try to prevent fires, fight fires, contain fires with the purpose of saving life, yes, but particularly of saving property. Well, there's a more traditional Asian and African approach to fire in cities, which is really a sort of more of a disposable technology. That is, you remove the portable personal property in the house's structure, manage the fire if it's possible according to the wind direction, but basically let the structure burn down and then simply replace the structure and put your personal belongings back in. That is, people are differently vulnerable, they're differently resilient, and they adapt over time to fire in different ways. What is a fire? Because we need to be aware of that too, the more chemical phenomena. Fire must also be considered in terms of its purely physical and chemical properties, what we call the fire triangle, also known as the combustion triangle. And this fire triangle is a simple model for understanding a chemical reaction which must occur to create fire, and it's composed of three elements. And you can see this clearly on your screen there in the circle. It's composed of fuel, that is the material to burn. It also needs heat, a heat source for ignition. And finally, it needs oxygen. It needs oxygen to stay alight. Without oxygen, fires can't be lit. And the fire triangle demonstrates basically the independence of these elements. All must be present for a fire to ignite and burn, and the removal of any one of these elements prevents or extinguishes a fire. And it will be apparent then from the elements that compose this fire triangle that fires burn differently according to the different kinds of fuel that they have, the different sources of heat or ignition, and the different levels of oxygen. Now, this is less of a consideration outdoors, though it can still be an important consideration according to altitude and elevation. And these variations in topography, climate, and fuel available determine how fires burn. It determines their pattern, frequency, and intensity over time, which we call fire regimes. Now, urban fire is a very singular hazard. Urban fire has a set of properties that basically distinguishes it from all other kinds of hazards. It's unique among natural hazards because urban fire is owned in that its source of origin basically lies within a person's property and depends for its ignition largely on the actions or inactions of the owner, what has been placed in that space, and on the provisions made to mitigate or suppress its propagation. It is, in a sense, the only natural hazard initiated entirely by humans, as the incidence of urban fire being auto-generated, as opposed to the case of wildfires, is so rare now that it can be effectively dismissed. In the past, you used to have lightning strikes hitting wooden structures in urban areas and causing fire, but that's all very, very rare these days. Urban fire is also a major hazard. Fire-related burns account for between 180,000 to 300,000 deaths per annum, and the true figure is possibly 6 times higher because a lot of these fires are never reported or recorded. They also result in a conservative estimate at the loss of 10 million disability-adjusted life years every year. It's the 4th largest cause of accidental injury, and nearly 11 million people are burnt severely enough each year to require medical attention. Fire-related deaths represented 5% of all injury deaths globally. I'm afraid these figures are from 2014. One of the things that you will soon find out about urban fire is that there are statistics, and reliable statistics are rare to find. And it's interesting that in 2014, the equivalent figure for war, loss from war, was 2%. So 5% for fire, 2% for war. And for every fire fatality, many more are left with lifelong disabilities and disfigurements that have severe social and economic consequences, both for the burn victims, but also for their families. What are the main causes of urban fire today? Well, the primary main cause is faulty electrical appliances and the impromptu electrical connections and hazardous crisscrossing wires that transport illegally tapped electricity. And in Manila, I'm sure, and Philippines, we're all very aware of that. The picture I have up there is from Nepal. Almost looks like a work of art, doesn't it? Apart from faulty electrical appliances, the other major causes are open flames, use of candles, kerosene or gas canister stoves, firewood, charcoal stoves, etc. Bonfires and burning waste, the careless disposal of cigarette butts, and of course arson to facilitate land grabbing, something that also needs to be considered. And also simply the condition of the informal or slum areas, the overcrowding, the poor construction practices, the use of inferior and flammable materials, lack of services, basically poverty and its associated conditions. Now I've put there at the end in a shaded type war, because I'm not going to talk about war, but war and urban fire is also very closely connected, both purposely and as a result of that. But that's another conversation altogether. But it's worth bearing in mind. It's an invisible hazard, and that's perhaps the most surprising thing about urban fire. The reason for this partial invisibility, I think, lies in the fact that over 95% of deaths and burn injuries are in lower and middle income countries, where they affect the very poorest in society. And such fires rarely make international news. The risk of fires is strongly associated with informal and slum settlements of the cities in the global south, and the growing number of tent cities housing the increasing millions of displaced persons in conflict areas. Fire policy and mitigation strategies in these locations is constrained by inadequate capacity and resources, lack of data collection and analysis, simply just there isn't the research, and in the last resort by neglect and indifference. Fires that spread to adjoining properties and cause mass fatalities are now relatively rare in high-income countries. They do occur, but they're very rare, and you know, they then get news attention, but they are very rare. And the reason why they're rare is because urban zoning, the enforcement of fire safety measures and fire prevention practices, and a comparatively well-trained emergency service have limited and confined its impact usually to a single dwelling. So in high-income countries, it's, and actually not just high-income countries, but in the cores of cities, even in the global south, it's basically a single building that burns down. Occasionally it spreads to the next one, but it's not a large conflagration. And it's interesting in this respect that urban fire is the only major hazard not included as a category in the International Red Cross and Red Crescent's annual World Disaster Report. Wildfire is there, urban fire is not at all. It's simply absent. It's invisible as a hazard. Outside of the global north, however, fire is a pressing issue in the sprawling informal settlements of the developing world's megacities. More than 50% of the world's people now live in urban areas, and 70 million new residents are added each year to that total. Over 90% of the urban growth occurs in lower and middle income countries that are currently expanding at the rate of 1 million people each week. And these are old statistics. I'm sure the figures are actually higher now. And approximately 25% of the world's urban population live in informal settlements and slums. The residents in these informal settlements live in small, makeshift structures, packed together with a minimum of planning. They're made mainly from poor quality materials that are highly flammable and have a higher heat release properties. The use of polymer-based materials, plastic sheets, etc., are very common. Formal building codes in lower and middle income countries rarely apply to housing in informal and low income sectors, where some 60 to 70% of the population live. Mike Davis, in a book about 10 or 15 years ago, talked about the world now as a, quote, the title of his book, Planet of Slums. But he failed to note that these are also flammable slums. So that's my first half, just introducing you to urban fire and how we need to think about it as a social construction, as an invisible hazard, and as something that affects the poorest people most pressingly. And in the second half of my presentation, I want to turn and look at urban fire regimes in Manila. I'll say, first of all, a few words about what is an urban fire regime. Then I'll talk about the emergence of urban fire regimes in colonial Manila, and then finish my presentation by talking a little about contemporary urban fire regimes. So what is an urban fire regime? Well, we've seen how history, context, and culture create specific urban fires. Hopefully I've shown you that. Where a definition of urban fire is the interplay between the materials around, reduced to so much fuel, people rendered vulnerable to varying degrees through their unequal exposure to its impact, and forms of ignition where natural, that is autogenic fire, are unlikely, and much more likely are human-induced or anthropogenic fires. And where the definition of an urban fire regime is therefore the interplay between the totality of environmental conditions, the climate, topography, natural resources, with the political system that organizes and sustains human settlements at any precise moment in time, and then finally the specific social and cultural uses of fire. And the point I want to make here very clearly is that urban fire regimes, like everything else to do with people, change with time, place, and circumstance. So let's consider colonial Manila first. And colonial Manila is epitomized by a two-city model. It's even historically delineated. There's intramuros, the city within the walls, and you can see in the painting from around mid-17th century, showing intramuros, the city within the walls, and then outside of the walls, beyond the walls, extramuros. We look first at intramuros. The city the Spanish founded in 1571 was a city built of wood. Even the churches and public buildings were made of wood. The use of flammable materials and the compact nature of Spanish urbanism inadvertently created a major fire hazard, especially during the dry, non-rainy season. And we know from historical sources that fire menaced Manila many times in its early decades. The city had at least three or four major fires by 1588, barely 15 years after its foundation, including the Great Fire of 1583 that virtually razed the wooden city to the ground. Fire was such a hazard that Governor General Santiago de Vera ordered that all further houses in Intramuros be built of stone in 1587. So that by 1609, Intramuros's 600 dwellings were, one contemporary source, quote, mostly of stone. And this stone city prospered until 8 p.m. on the 30th of November, 1645, when a 7.9 modified Mercalli scale earthquake struck central Luzon. It destroyed 150 of the finest buildings in Intramuros. It caused so much damage that most of the remaining structures had to be demolished, and the city was rocked by further major earthquakes during the 17th century, most notably in 1658, 1675, and 1699. As Joseph Fayol sadly noted in the 1640s, and here I'm quoting from him, the result has proven that the inhabitants of Manila, while avoiding in their buildings the activity of fire, fell into the terrible power of the earth. What about extramuros? Well, matters were very different in that other city, much larger city. That is, extramuros dominated by the so-called Baha'i Kubo construction, primarily houses built of bamboo, wood, and palm. And the concentration of these highly flammable structures created an urban fire regime that the fire historian Stephen Pine argues resembles built wildlands. That is, city drying and wetting with the same rhythm as the natural vegetation around them. And people responded to the constant threat of fire by building cheaply and furnishing them sparingly. They accepted the periodic loss as owners could quickly rebuild from local materials. They were mainly concerned with removing their valuable personal belongings and then letting the fire sweep through. And you get these reports of people seeing which way the fire is coming, and they simply take their belongings away and let the fire burn through and then rebuild and put their belongings back. These constructions also had the added advantage of not severely injuring people if they did collapse, an advantage that was well known to the inhabitants of Intramuros, who, from reports we know, quickly moved their families to them in the aftermath of earthquakes or when the city was experiencing tremors. Now, fire remained a feature of colonial Manila till beginning of the 19th century, with, in a sense, both cities achieving a certain balance. Intramuros, by adapting European architecture that fused the use of less flammable materials with the plasticity of native structures, and extramuros, accepting the recurrent loss of flammable homes that were easily rebuilt and periodically required renewing anyhow to maintain water resistance and to control vermin infestation. However, the growth of Manila in the 19th century, with the population tripling to around 340,000 people, basically destroyed this equilibrium or balance as the stone city burst its confines and spread out into the other city, creating greater combustibility and large suburban fires. In the 19th century, we get reports of large suburbs burning down. This therefore required the adoption of new measures, and we get a raft of legislation in the 19th century, decreeing two-story maximum height to buildings, wide streets, the division of the city into zones, separating houses made from different materials, the light materials from the stone materials, the creation of fire breaks. It's interesting to note that Divisoria, the large market, was originally designed, as the name suggests, as a fire break to divide the various types of buildings. And finally, at the end of the century, in the 1870s, we get the creation of the first fire brigade and a system in the 1880s of hydraulic water supply, leading to the sort of pictures you get on the slide here, acting as a source of water for urban areas. What about contemporary fire management? Well, American Manila continued, basically, I would argue, the growth pattern of the late 19th century, with the expansion of the city core beyond Intramuros and the development of contingent areas around that core, that initial core. But I would argue it didn't fundamentally change this two-city model of fire regime. However, the destruction of World War II, the growing dominance of the automobile, and the exponential population growth created a new kind of city, what Edwin Wise calls an archipelagic metropolis. Not just a single core, but multiple cores, starting with the development of Quezon City after 1948 by the government, and then by Makati by private capital. Till now, Metro Manila is composed of 16 highly urbanized cities with a combined population of over 13 million. However, I would argue it's still a variant of the two-city fire model, now only replicated around multiple urban core nodes, comprising the modern city centers, including the government buildings, upmarket residences, commercial and retail sectors laid out on a grid pattern, and then the other much larger city comprising a dense mix of industrial, commercial, and old and new residential buildings with narrow lanes and informally built structures often made of highly flammable materials. The main cause of fire still, as I suggested in the first half of my talk, is short circuits caused by overheating, aging or outdated equipment, and substandard electrical wiring. Now, electrical faults can be generated at any time of the year, but the increasing summer heat means that sparks from faulty electrical connections or overloaded AC units or fans are increasingly easily igniting fires as well. And that's another question of, with climate change, with greater heat in urban areas, are we seeing more urban fire? What about contemporary fire management? Well, here, this might be a little bit more controversial. I would argue that today's fire management in Manila is also a continuation of a model derived from a European urban fire regime basis, exported through colonialism. People mainly think now, of course, of the fire brigade as being started by the Americans, but as I already told you, it actually began with the Spanish. And this model is based on a fire service equipped with large fire trucks, a system of roads wide enough to accommodate those trucks, and an extensive grid of fire hydrants with adequate water pressure. Now, this model of fire management may work for those urban cores, but doesn't for the much larger other cities, where narrow streets or alleys can't accommodate fire trucks, they're not big enough. Traffic congestion immobilizes emergency vehicles, and the absence or non-functioning of hydrants, often due to privatization, and that's another question altogether, which we can discuss perhaps in the question time, is also a major feature. The Bureau of Fire Protection reports an increasing number of fires. There were recorded 143,970 fires nationally between 2006 to 2007, including an annual increase of 5% when the population was only growing by 2%. So it suggests that the number of fires is increasing. As I said all along, these official figures are likely to be seriously underestimations of the real causes. Work that's been done in India, in fact, suggests that the real figures are about 6 times higher than those recorded. Now, whether that's true in the Philippines, I don't know, but it's just an indication. Okay, finally then, what about urban fire and the future? Well, there's already an extensive literature that links higher summer temperatures and lower humidity with increased frequency and severity of wildfires. There is quite a lot of research done on this. Why? Because, of course, it mainly affects places like the southwest of the United States, Australia, and the Mediterranean. But now we're also seeing these kinds of fires in Siberia and India as well. The studies of global wildfire activity suggest an 18.7% rise in global mean fire weather seasons across the globe over recent decades. But these studies also stress the causal role of anthropogenic-induced changes in land cover, including urbanization, in increasing fire risk. So that urban fire risk is likely to increase with climate change variability. And I've done some work in Delhi, in India, which shows that that is occurring. And I think finally, I'd like to leave you with this comment that 2 elements are likely to define our daily lives in the future with climate change. One is water and the other is fire. Water, fresh and the lack of it, or the excess of it in the form of flood, and fire and the excess of it, and fire where fire is perceived not to belong, that is, in the urban environment. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bankoff. Before everything else, we would like to quickly acknowledge the presence of our very own Executive Director, Dr. Mahar Lagmay, as well as Attorney Mark Gamboa, a UPRI Fellow and the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of SENS. On that note, actually, Dr. Bankoff himself is one of our UPRI Fellows. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Dr. Lagmay and Attorney Gamboa. That being said, we highly appreciate your very informative presentation, Dr. Bankoff. It is really enlightening to know how fire was utilized throughout our history, how it helped us advance and increase our quality of life, but also how it can be destructive and take lives and property. As you have also noted, urban fires aren't just a physical hazard anymore, but an invisible hazard that is seemingly discriminatory in its victims. That is a difficult discussion that many may not want to partake in due to its implications, but that's just what makes it incredibly important to discuss. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot about urban fires and the dangers they possess, especially the underlying societal issues looming over them. But I'm also certain that many have their own thoughts and questions. So at this point in time, we will be opening the floor for questions any of our attendees may have. Please use the Zoom reaction button to raise your hand and wait for the host, me, to call your name and unmute you before speaking. For those who would prefer it, we will also entertain questions sent to the chat box. Those watching through Facebook Live or YouTube may also comment their questions below. Now, the floor is officially open for the Q&A session. I see we already have multiple participants raising their hands. From our UPRI, April Tehelan, you can now unmute your mic.
Hi, this isn't a question, more like a reaction to Dr. Bankoff's presentation. So I would just like to say that we appreciate how your presentation viewed the idea of urban fire from another perspective, and that you contextualize it in the context of the Philippines. And I think this is important because we often overlook the historical and social aspects of fire, and that we tend to focus on the structural and the quantitative aspects of it. It's probably because putting the historical and social aspects of fire into a workable framework when researching about fire is pretty difficult. So that we appreciate that your presentation allowed us to view the phenomenon of urban fire from another paradigm.
Could I just respond to that briefly, April? I mean, you say it's difficult to find out the social and historical. I think I would disagree with you. I think it's just that we don't do the research. I mean, it is, you know, if you actually go down and do surveys, research in actually people whose houses have been burnt, people who live in flammable areas, they will tell you all about how they use fire, and the problems of fire and the frequency of fire. So I think it's simply that we're not doing the research that needs to be done, as we would with any other hazard. And that, of course, raises the question of why don't we do that research? Why is urban fire such an invisible hazard?
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Miss April, and thank you for that response, Dr. Greg. It is actually very concerning to know that there is not that much research in urban fires considering the proportionate dangers they possess, especially in urban cities. We have another hand raised from the participants from Miss Arj. You may now unmute.
Yes, I'm Arch from UPRI. So I recall Dr. Greg framing urban fire as a result of action or inaction of the owners of affected buildings. But I think in the context of informal settlements in developing countries, especially in the Philippines, it may be uh, a result of their lack of capacity to improve their conditions or maybe remove themselves from fire-prone areas. So my question is, in your opinion, what role does the government should fulfill to minimize the risk of fire in urban areas, given that fire affects mostly private properties?
Yeah, okay, that's a very good question. And I think there are certain things that we can do. And I think, as I tried to suggest, and I am not in any way casting any aspersions over the great work that the Bureau of Fire Protection does. It's modeled on a system that doesn't apply to most informal areas. It doesn't work in the same way. So we need, I think, to supplement the existing fire management service with a new kind of fire service that is based around, and here we go back to exactly this kind of resilience that what the UP Resilience Institute is talking about, which is community-based disaster risk reduction. In this case, it would be fire risk reduction. We need local sources of water, and I have all sorts of ideas about that. We need different kinds of firefighting equipment, the use, for instance, of motorcycles, to be able to negotiate narrow alleys, perhaps in some cases the use of foam, and I've already had this conversation, and there are no manufacturers, or it's very expensive to get foam in the Philippines, and that's something that could be looked at. And having local fire ready, basically a community-based fire management system. I think that would help enormously in combating fires. So it's not an intractable problem. It's just one that isn't really addressed properly because it's not seen as being a really pressing concern, when of course I think it is. And I mean, you just have to see the scale of some of the fires that happen in, we're talking about Manila, but we could be talking about any urban area in the Philippines, where it's hundreds of houses that go up in flames, and it's thousands of people whose shelters, their homes are burnt, but often also their livelihood. So it's a lot of both livelihood and home.
Thank you for that, Dr. Greg. I saw Dr. Lagmay raise his hand. Do you have a question, Doctor? Or was that an accident?
No, it was not an accident.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Hi, Greg. Good afternoon. Yeah, it seems like you have already a lot based on your presentation about urban fire. And I know that we've been talking about the work on urban fire in Metro Manila, the research that you wanted to start. Are you expecting anything or expecting to discover anything more than what you've found in your research and global research on urban fire?
No, that's interesting. And I mean, what we don't know is actually the particular uses, the social cultural uses of fire in the Philippines in the same way. I mean, I've indicated broad trends. These are again the kind of things that you can generalize about, but until you do the detailed work, we simply won't know whether there are specific characteristics of fire and urban fire regimes in the Philippines, in Manila, or in any urban environment. So I think we need to do that research. We also need to find out how frequent they are, because we don't really have statistics that in any way reflect the real incidence of fires. I remember in February when I was walking around with a fireman, and we went into a house that had just been burnt down, and the owner was rebuilding the building, still living in it. Yeah, they built a temporary structure. It was the second time that building had been burnt down, and I was chatting to the wife, a woman in probably her early 50s, and I asked her how many times that she'd had a major fire in her life, and she said probably around 6. Now, that's anecdotal. Of course, that's totally anecdotal. But I mean, if we're really talking about that kind of frequency, then this is an incredible a problem for people.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were going to say something, Bahar. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. We're going to start this project, right? I hope so.
I hope
AC and Marcus have contacted you already.
No,
Have they?
no,
Not yet?
nobody's contacted me. I was actually waiting for this presentation afterwards, and then I was going to contact you and see where
Well,
where we are.
Okay, so this is the go signal already. Let's go ahead with this project in Metro Manila, and I hope we find good results so that we can help decrease the rising frequency of urban fire in Metro Manila or in the Philippines.
If we can just make people more aware of the problem, I mean, that would be a huge major achievement in itself. I think it's, as I said, it's generally an invisible hazard. And as I've suggested, I think it's because those people who determine the parameters of disaster studies and disasters are mainly in Western countries, and it's not a problem there. I mean, it is. I mean, people have fire services and things, but it's not a major issue as it is in the global South and the cities of the global South. And I think that's the big difference. One thing I perhaps didn't mention, and it's also very important, is that urban fire has a distinct gender profile. That actually the main victims of fire disproportionately are women between the ages of 18 and 35. Why? Because they're the cookers. They're so we have also, I think we could have a huge discussion about, whether this is a gender bias as well in terms of our neglect of urban fire.
Wow. Okay, so I look
now
forward.
whether that applies in the Philippines, I don't know. I mean, these are figures from and that's the kind of stuff we will find out.
Yes, yeah, interesting. Well, we start today, Greg.
Brilliant.
All right. Okay.
Very enlightening. Thank you, Dr. Mahar, for sharing your thoughts and really the future plans in combating this disaster, this fire hazard. We received a lot of questions from anonymous participants in our Q&A section. One participant asked, what can you say about the cultural attitudes towards fire risk and safety in Manila or in general, and how do they impact fire prevention and response?
Yeah, I mean, because we haven't done the research, and I'm sorry to hark on this, that's more speculation on actual specific fire risks and perceptions at the moment. It's difficult to say. I mean, partly I think it's because of the structures around people's homes. I mean, we've talked about faulty wiring. I mean, that and illegal electricity. It's very difficult to surmount those or go around those. I mean, we have a problem. We have the problem of people using increasingly, and again, this is something I would like to find out. It's certainly true in other countries, the increasing uses of air AC units. But faulty ones, secondhand ones, because people can't afford new ones, so they get secondhand ones, which are perhaps faulty, and then they get overloaded. So there are inherent structural problems. Then there's the question of cooking. How is cooking done in a lot of places? Well, it's still done in many cases with an open flame, and that's a problem. Too. I mean, I think less so perhaps in the Philippines than other areas. But again, we need to know. We need to know how people cook their food. What kind of cooking source do they use? What kind of fuels do they use? Because that will tell us. In many countries, I mean, where the most research has been done, which is in South African informal settlements, a huge cause of fire is the use of bombolas, the gas canisters, and them exploding. And there are some incredibly alarming statistics about the dangers of those. Again, to what extent is this the case in Manila? Let's find out. And once we have a decent research basis, then we can start making some recommendations that have a foundation in research and truth, and in fact. And I think that's really what it comes down to. To a certain extent, what I've been talking about today in Manila I mean, I've done some research on colonial Manila. I have not done research on fire in contemporary Manila. So I'm speculating in a sense. I'm drawing conclusions based on more generalizations. I would love to have a much firmer basis of foundation on which to make those statements.
Dude, I couldn't agree more, Dr. Bankoff. We have one question from a participant, Joseph Aquino. Has there any study available on how to address the fire hazards of electricity wires in urban slums and informal settlements related to government policy regulation or risk mitigation programs to be required from Meralco or Maynila and Manila Water?
Right, you're asking me a specific question about the Philippines, and the answer is I don't know. But I mean, what I can say is that even more generally, that is a really good question, and I'm not aware of any research that's done on that in a large scale. And I mean that we have an inordinate amount of research on wildfire. Why? Because it's affecting increasingly Western cities, and we have an extraordinary absence of research on urban fire in the global South. And so again, I'm sorry to sort of come back to the same. I'm not aware of any research, but it's a very good question, and it's maybe there are ways of trying to a cheap form of insulation to try and stop that kind of urban fault, that fire fault happening. I mean, again, this is where we need engineers, we need all sorts of people to actually look at these problems. But as I can just reiterate again, if we make a greater awareness of this problem, then the research and the solutions will start to come. It's simply because we don't look at it.
Indeed, the importance of study and data really can't be overstated enough in this
I don't
instance.
think so. I really just emphasize, if you take away that message, then I think then that's a really a good outcome.
We have one more question from Amado Nino. Good afternoon. I would just like to ask if Sir Bankoff has ongoing partnerships with the DENR's Project Transform team, which they recently shared to help cater to the individual problems of areas tailored to their specific concerns, considering that these urban fires may have varying costs and solutions for the different areas and may not have one solution for all.
I think that's very true. And one of the things we haven't talked about, of course, so far this afternoon is the use of urban fire as arson to clear land. I mean, clearly there are very different uses and reasons why fires happen, and sometimes they're lit purposely to clear land for development purposes. So, I mean, yes, there are a host of different reasons why. When we're talking about generalizations about causes of fire, these are the main areas where most people accept that this is the main. I mean, I've talked to fire people and fire in the fire service, and they will all say that it's electrical faults is the main problem. Interestingly, and again, and I think this is an issue that came up and I was made aware of only a couple of months ago, is with the hydrants and the water supply. So even if the fire trucks get there, they find that actually the water has been cut off because some of the water companies, if a hydrant is damaged or illegally tapped by local inhabitants, the water companies turn off the water, not just of that hydrant, but all the hydrants around it. They don't tell anybody about that. So the fire service turns up and there is no water in the hydrant. Again, so there are a host of different reasons and lots of ways in which we can improve fire safety.
Yes, this problem really highlights how the hazard of fire is multisectoral and touches on a lot of sectors. We have one question from UPLB INREM. Based on your presentation, huge fire trucks may be ineffective to a certain extent for urban areas with narrow roads. May we know if you have suggestions on how to purge fires effectively for areas that are unreachable by the bigger fire trucks?
Yeah, I think there's, and I've seen this in certain countries, the use of fire motorcycle trucks, if you will, motorcycle fire services, if you like, which of course can negotiate those very narrow alleys. Now they can't carry much and they can't carry water. That's the problem. So they need to carry foam instead. And as I suggested in my presentation, that's a problem apparently because there isn't a cheap source of foam suppressant. In the Philippines, it's expensive, but certainly, we can use different kinds of mechanical access, different, more creative ways of using smaller vehicles to negotiate those alleys. And I think, secondly, and most importantly, is having a local source of water available in barrios, in barangays. To actually have and we have some ideas about how that can be done too, in actually providing a cheap source of water, so that before the fire service arrives, and traffic is another problem. I mean, I first became aware of urban fire as a problem when I was sitting in a traffic jam, this was about 10 or 12 years ago in Manila, and there was a fire truck going the other way and we hadn't moved for an hour and a half and its blue light was flashing and it just simply couldn't move and nobody could get out of the way to let it through. So whatever fire it was on its way to, it never got there. So traffic is another issue. Even when you have access, is getting a truck there. So a local source of water, a local volunteer fire service, I think are essential elements of that. But again, perhaps with recommendations, we'll find out more about that.
Thank you, Dr. Bankoff. Dr. Lagmay, you have a question? You may not unmute your mic.
Yeah, I just have one more question. In your work, Greg, did you find out what the percentage of arson is in all the fires that happens in a certain metropolis?
No, that's really difficult to find out, Maha. I mean, because I mean, it would be a lot of people are very mute about talking about the use of fire to clear land. It's difficult to determine from evidence of people whether a fire was deliberately set or not, and this is a problem. But I mean, we know it happens. And of course, I mean, you get the reports, whether they're anecdotal or not, again, would be interesting to know, of cats and dogs being drenched in fuel and set alight and sent into suburbs and tearing around, setting things up. Now, we need, again, is that true? I don't know. I mean, it's certainly in the press whether that happens. But whether that's actually confirmed, we need to find out. But that again is an interesting question, and it's a very political one. And I guess that's what leads me on to talking. I was trying to make clear in my presentation that the social and political elements of fire are almost as important, well, just as important as the chemical and the physical properties of fire, because that's a very political question, of course. Why that happens.
Yeah.
And why it's allowed to happen, and perhaps why it's tolerated even, that it happens. How many prosecutions have been done? I don't know in the Philippines. That would be, I simply, we just don't know these kind of figures. But again, as I said, there's a huge area of research here. It's like any other hazard, there are many, many facets. It's totally interdisciplinary. One person can't hope to actually manage the whole thing. What we really need is a team of people looking at different aspects of it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Dr. Lagmay, and thank you, Dr. Bankoff, for such interesting discussion. But unfortunately, due to limited time, we will not be able to entertain all of the questions our attendees have given us. You may, however, send them to the UPRI Facebook page as messages, and this will be forwarded to Dr. Bankoff after this session. Before we officially end today's episode, we would like to request everyone to open your videos for a quick photo op.
Hi everyone. Can I request everyone to turn on their videos? Okay, so we have 4 panels. I'm asking everyone to hold their smiles. I'm on the first panel. Okay. I'm on the third now. Okay, there. We're done. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Miss April. With that, we now move on to the end of our webinar. Thank you once again to Dr. Bankoff for sharing his time and knowledge with us this afternoon. As always, this webinar has been brought to you by the UP Nova Center and UPRI in partnership with UNESCO International Geoscience Program or IGCP. We would also like to thank once again our partners for this episode, the Lyceum of the Philippines Laguna Biology Society, the UP Los Baños Integrated Natural Resources and Environment Management, the Association of Filipino Forestry Students UPLB, the UP Volcano Tectonics Laboratory, the Mapua Malayan Colleges Laguna, the UP Rockhounds, the Geological Organization of Partido State University, the Association of Geologists and Geological Engineers of Mapua, the Mindoro State University College of Arts and Sciences, Yaman, Philippines, the Center of Neighborhood Studies, and the Philippine Association of Geology Students Society of Economic Geologists Student Chapter. Resilience Live will be held every last Thursday of the month, so mark your calendars. The next session will be on June 27. Please stay tuned to the UPRI Facebook page for announcements on our next speaker and featured topic. Before we officially close this afternoon's webinar, please be reminded that participants will be issued a certificate of attendance once they have answered the evaluation form. You may find the link to the form in the chat box below. Thank you and see you all at the next session of Resilience Live. Once again, my name is Rick and it's been a pleasure being your host today.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Greg.
No worries. Nice to see everybody.
Thank you po.
Thank you. Bye. Have another meeting. Greg will be in touch with you. I already instructed AC and Marcus to contact you.
Wonderful, Maha.
All right. Okay.
Thank
All
you.
Right. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Salamat.
We will keep the Zoom meeting for 5 minutes to give time for answering the evaluation form. The webinar will close in 5,